Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. A big welcome to you all. My name is Sean, and I'm delighted you are joining us for today's ESPC community webinar. Today I am joined by Damien Bird, MVP, who will cover Create and Populate Excel fast via Graph or Office scripts. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is @ESPC_community, and our hashtag is #ESPC24. Tweet us, tag us, and tell you what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hub, which is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the Content tab on the top. Don't let the learning stop here. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next webinar, Hot Seat, Power Platform Governance with David O'Rourke, Microsoft. This webinar is the fourth webinar of Microsoft Power Platform Week and takes place tomorrow, Wednesday, March 27th, from 11 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. CET. For more information on this webinar, please check out sharepoint.com/Microsoft Power Platform Week. Attention to all individuals considering attending the European Power Platform Conference. Our exclusive super early bird promotion will conclude tomorrow, Wednesday at midnight, March 27th. From Thursday, March 28th onwards, ticket prices will be subject to an increase. Seize this final chance to capitalize on its current offer. Secure your spot today by visiting www.sharepointeurope.com/European Power Platform Conference pricing. Stay ahead in the ever-evolving world of Microsoft 365 with ESPC24. Gain invaluable insights, network with peers, and supercharge your career. Don't miss out on the super early bird sale. Book your tickets now, www.sharepointeurope.com/pricing. After this webinar, we'll have a questions and answers section. Type any questions you might have into the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it's available. And now I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Damien. Hello, Damien. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi there, folks. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on. Fantastic. So I'm just going to make sure I get my screen shared first. So if you just let me know my screen's coming up. And
I can see it there, Damien.
Nice one. So I'll do a quick intro. First of all, I'd like to say, yeah, thanks very much for having me on. And also a slight confession, I maybe need to update my profile. I was an MVP. I still have, just by my side, I've got my MVP trophy. But I'm now at Microsoft, so I'm actually a cloud solution architect. So you'll see from my who am I here on screen. And I do a lot in the community. So I help on the forums, hang out on Reddit and on the Microsoft forum and Facebook, WhatsApp groups, etc. Primarily on Power Automate. But my sort of main place to be is on my YouTube. So I quite like sharing ideas on my YouTube. And this is very much a combination of some of my videos that I've done previously, today's demonstration. That's what it's all about. I'll also be in Belgium as well, so or in Brussels, yes. I'm very excited to potentially see folk in June. So my session today is all about creating and populating Excel files fast via two options, Graph API or Office scripts. Of course, this is all in Power Automate. And I have got a series of demos. I've also got a series of slides as well. So I'll hopefully give you some sort of foundation knowledge about Graph API and also Office scripts if you've not seen it before. But also I'll have some demonstrations, and fingers crossed the demo gods behave and everything runs okay. So I'm going to kick things off with what is the Graph API, and you'll see it's quite often referred to as giraffe in the community. I've got my little soft toy giraffe here beside me that my daughter put together for me a while ago, So the Graph API is a way of extending and reaching multiple different data sources across the Microsoft ecosystem. Exposes lots of different REST APIs, and Excel, as you can see in the slide there, is very much one of those endpoints that you can hit. So you can update, you can read Excel files using the Graph API. And quite often in Power Automate, your first point of call is, of course, the Excel connector. And you often need to have a table in that file to access that data. So with the Graph API, you can actually write to Excel, read Excel without there being a table. You can add a table, you can create sheets. There's all sorts of different actions you can perform using this API. And if you're new to the Graph API, there is a tool called the Graph Explorer. So as someone who's new, you might want to head over onto the Graph Explorer tool, and I'll fire that up shortly and maybe have a quick look at it. But it enables you to practice and play with that Graph API as yourself. You're yourself logged on, and then you can access some of those endpoints, get data about yourself, get data about different applications. And if you think about the different connectors you use it in the Power Platform, the Teams connector, the Outlook connector, you're limited by the actions that are available on those connectors. Whereas behind those actions and that connector, there is the Graph API, and there's potentially extra calls that you can access. And so quite kindly, within the platform, we have a series of different connectors known as HTTP requests. So the majority of these HTTP request actions that you see here, there's one that's just, I think, been released for Teams at the top, but there's also one for Outlook, for users, and for groups, I think it is. Those top four that we have here, they are all currently standard actions, and so allow you to call the Graph API as yourself, as a user, and access all these wonderful APIs behind Graph. There is a fifth one, invoke an HTTP request, that you can see on there. There's a massive diamond on it just to indicate that it is premium. It is available, and that's the one I'm going to be using for writing to Excel. And of course, that gives you access to pretty much any Graph API you can think of that sits behind the scenes. So standard for the first four, premium for the last one, and each of those four will have different limits on the actions and groups of actions that they can access. So if at any point you're unsure, best to refer to the documentation for those ones. So on screen, the invoke an HTTP request that I have up there, you'll see there's a method. So when you want to call an API, you need to know if you're going to get some data or patch some data. In this case, I'm writing to a file, so I'm patching. And then you'll see the beginning of the URL, which is graph.microsoft.com. And then I've got some dynamic values, which include a site GUID, a drive GUID, and also a sheet range in this case. And then the body of the request in this screenshot is actually an array of data, because unlike the add a row to a table, which you often use in Power Automate, using the Graph API, you can actually write arrays of data. So a whole table of data in one action, rather than looping through multiple rows and obviously generating quite an inefficient flow. So I'm going to fire up the Graph Explorer just as a quick demonstration, and we'll bring up my screen now, and here we go. So this is very much the Graph Explorer. I'm logged on as myself here. I'm connected to my tenant, and you'll see on the left-hand side here, I've got lots of different examples of potential Graph API calls. There are, the Excel ones will be in amongst here somewhere. That'll probably just flash past me. There we go, there's some Excel ones. So you can see examples of some of the actions that you can do in the Graph Explorer. This isn't the limit, there are still more. These are just samples to get you up and running, and of course there are links to the various documents. So if I was to go into the Get Started, we see that we're already on Get My Profile. Here is the endpoint. I can run that query, and we can see, all being good, I got an OK back, and I can see some of the data about my profile on Entra ID. So this is a great place to get started if you've never used the Graph Explorer, and lots of different potential opportunities here. There's also quite an interesting one that I'll highlight. I do have a video on it. It's in the Outlook mail, you can actually create a draft email in your inbox. So I'm just having a look here. That particular example is not in this list here, but if you've ever had a requirement to produce a draft email into your draft folder in your Outlook, imagine you want to send an email to someone, then rather than send it direct using the send an email action in Power Automate, instead you could potentially use Graph, generate a draft email, and then just pop open your draft folder and send an email from there. So lots of opportunity with the Graph API. So if I jump back onto my slides, the next thing that I really want to give you an intro into are Office scripts. And so Office scripts now have been about, I think, for about 18 months or so. Certainly, I've been playing about with them for around about that amount of time. And one of the great things about it is, well, not only is it a feature of Excel, it's also a feature that you can integrate with Power Automate. So you can actually write scripts, either if you're a pro code or a semi-pro coder, you can write JavaScript or TypeScript as it's known to generate a script for Excel. But you can also use a recording tool, very much like a macro, and you can record your steps and you can parameterize some of those properties within the script so that you can either pass them into the sheet from the sheet itself. You'll be prompted to provide various parameters, or you can actually call these from Power Automate and pass parameters into your Office script from Power Automate. So you'll see on screen I've got the requirements. It's predominantly based on Excel on the web, and things like being able to run scripts and create new scripts, and also use something called script buttons. You can also use script buttons in the Windows version. There are licensing requirements, but majority of people are already covered in this situation. And when I come to show you Office scripts, if you go and have a look yourself and then discover that you haven't got the Automate tab, which is a feature that's required in order for you to use the Office script, it may well be that someone has turned it off at organization level, because currently it's possible for your global admin to turn off the Office scripts feature from their tenant settings. So if you do get to the point of exploring Office scripts, wondering what it's all about, before even thinking about using it in Power Automate, if you can't find the tab that I'll show you shortly, it may well be that your tenant global admin has turned it off. So within Power Automate, there was one action, there's now actually two actions. The Office scripts used to live on your OneDrive, and therefore you would ultimately own that script and would share that script. But just in the last few months, there has been an action for SharePoint as well. It's very much the same, but you get to choose a different location for the script. Rather than it being in your OneDrive, you can have a look on various SharePoints, and therefore you can share those scripts amongst groups of that SharePoint site. So the limit for responses, as you can see here, are 5 meg, and the most amount of cells you can write in one go is 5 million, so it's pretty chunky. And hopefully, if everything goes well today, I'm going to try and demonstrate writing 20,000 rows to an Excel sheet in probably quicker than you can ever imagine if you've ever used the add a row to a table action in Power Automate. The other thing to be aware of is that the call to that run script action is limited to 1,600 calls per day. So if you're running this run script action and you want to run it more than 1,600 times a day, then you're obviously going to exceed that limit and will be throttled, or potentially even your flow will fail. But if you think about the power of the Office scripts, and what I'll be able to demonstrate is that just like Graph API, you're able to send batches of data to your Excel file. So rather than sending an individual row to that Excel file, you can actually send an array of data to that file. And not only can you just send an array of data, you can actually perform all sorts of actions on that Excel sheet too, like adding a table, changing the color, sorting the data, filtering the data, all sorts of things you can do. And in some of the videos you'll see on my YouTube, I demonstrate how to potentially use Office scripts to complete things like invoices. So target specific cells, build a script that allows you to add in someone's name, address, a date. Excel Office scripts are very, very flexible. And because it's a scripting language, you can write pretty much whatever you fancy within reason, albeit you'll see that one of the limits here is a timeout of 120 seconds. So you can't go beyond 2 minutes on the runtime of an Office script. The other thing to bear in mind is whilst Office scripts enables you to call APIs from the script itself, if you try and call that API whilst it's inside an Office script from Power Automate, that script will fail. And again, as another example, I recently deployed the ChatGPT service, and I was able to call that service directly from an Office script and pass data from the Excel Office script to the GPT service in order to generate some generative AI content. So there was no need for Power Automate for that particular solution. So if we look at a basic script, you can see what looks like JavaScript on screen. So this is it's TypeScript, which is a subset of JavaScript, and we define a function. We can then have our variables at the start here. So in this case, I have defined a worksheet, and it's based on the active worksheet. But you can use Office script to select a specific sheet in the workbook. You can get it to add worksheets, delete worksheets, etc. And then we have a very simple expression that is inserting a value into cell A1, welcome to Office scripts. So very much the equivalent of a hello world solution. So that's the sort of introduction to Office scripts. I'm just now going to jump into an overview, a live demo of what Office scripts is all about. So my browser is back up on screen. And what I'm going to do here is a little tip. If you ever work in Excel, if you type in excel.new, very much like if you type in word.new, you will be logged into a brand new Excel worksheet. And that worksheet will be created, I say worksheet, sorry, workbook. That workbook will be created in your OneDrive. So if you're ever looking for a quick way to generate an empty file, excel.new or word.new. So we're into my new Excel workbook. I have my Automate tab. Remember, if you don't have the Automate tab, then quite possibly someone has turned it off at tenant level within your organization. And then we have along the top here the scripts that I've written. We have some sample scripts that are available through the product team, and you can record your actions as well. So if, for instance, I wanted to well, let's go for it. Let's try recording a script. If I put this into record mode and I can type in Damien is doing a demo, and then if I hit the stop here, if we have a look at the code editor and go into edit, we should see that a script has been recorded that will type the values Damien is doing a demo into cell range A1 to A4. But if I delete that data from the sheet, and I'll actually capitalize Damien, and I'll change it to a live demo in the code. If I run that script, if we watch on the left-hand side, you'll see that data now pop into Office scripts. And that's basically what Office scripts is all about. You write a script, you can then pass in data. In this case, the data is fixed. But then with Power Automate, if you combine the power of Office scripts with Power Automate, you can pass in data into these scripts and obviously write into your own Excel sheet or create a brand new Excel sheet and write data rather efficiently. The other thing to call out on this particular script is the data that is currently presented here is nested arrays. So everything is in square brackets, so there is an array of arrays, and that's how the data is passed efficiently into this sheet. If I go into the script that I prepared earlier, adding data to Excel from an array. This is the script that I'm going to run from Power Automate. But you can see again an example of input parameters. And in this case, there are properties for Boolean, for true or false. And again, the great thing about this is when you define an function like this in Office scripts, these input parameters will actually appear dynamically within Power Automate. So where you traditionally go into an action and you go and populate all the parameters and fill in all the details and use dynamic pills, as they're called, by defining these input parameters in your script, Power Automate will automatically recognize that when you attach your script to the run script action. And if you provided default values, as I have here for the Boolean as false, I provide a sheet name where the sheet name is by default sheet 1, and the worksheet data is header 1, header 2, and 1 and 2 in this nested array. Because I provided sample data, that will also pull through into your Power Automate Cloud Flow. And again, the rest of the script is basically taking that data that's being passed. There's some logic there to check to see if the Boolean has been set for these things, if I want the data to be formatted as a table. So the script can actually do an awful lot, but you can also determine the logic based on the parameters that you set at the top here, and therefore what you set within your Cloud Flow. So it's quite a compact little script, but very powerful because it can take the data from an array, in this case a nested array, and write all that data into an Excel sheet in quick, fast time. So if we just jump back onto my slides, this is very much where I'm going to hopefully now jump into the demos and walk through the flows in real time, run a few flows, show you how it works, and hopefully explain in a bit more detail the logic and the expressions that are used. Before I start, I'm going to take a quick gulp of my orange juice, and if there are any questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'll jump into my demonstration.
No questions so far, Damien, so you can just jump straight in.
Cool.
Anyone has any questions, just put in the question box and we can read them at the end.
Cool, nice one. Okay, so to get things started, I have a traditional flow, and if I go into edit, I am going to use the new designer. I do use that in my videos now because ultimately the new designer is in global availability. And this is a traditional flow. This is very much a flow that is going to grab a big data set and is going to add a row into an existing table. And so if I jump back, actually, have I got this file open? Let's see if I can go and find the file that I need to show you. There we go, a file with a table. So I've got a file with a table, as you see here, that has one row in it, and I am going to use this flow here to write data to the Excel sheet in the traditional method. And what we can do is hopefully pitch it against the other methods that I'm going to demonstrate during this session. So all I'm doing here is I've got a query on a Power BI data set. I'm actually pulling across 20,000 rows. And with those 20,000 rows, I'm going to, well, parse them so I can get the data from that data set. And then using an add a row into a table, the traditional sense, I am going to add various data from my data set on Power BI into this sheet. So I'm going to put this into test mode. This is very much, like I say, the traditional method of writing data to a sheet. And with that underway, if we have a quick look at this sheet, we should hopefully just start seeing data slowly trickle into this sheet. And ultimately, what I'm going to demonstrate is writing all 20,000 of these rows into a sheet quicker than this particular flow will finish. There we go. So we can see now data is starting to appear in this sheet using that traditional method of looping through data, of which we have one of 20,000 rows. So an inefficient method. So jumping across onto this other flow that I've developed previously, and if I go into edit, what I have here is the two methods. One method using the graph API and another method using the run script. So graph is on the left, the run script is on the right. And at the start of this, I have a very simple compose action which has a nested array. So this is defining the columns. I've got 3 columns here called column 1, 2, and 3. That is the header of my data. And then I'm using a select, and you'll see me use selects a lot in my videos, to actually generate 100,000 rows. So in this particular demonstration, I'm going to write 100,000 rows of data into an Excel sheet, and then in the next demo, I'll do 20,000 from Power BI. So in this particular example, I'm using an expression called range, and range will generate an array of numbers starting from 0 and then the number of numbers I've required, so 100,000 numbers. And then using that same structure, a nested array with open square brackets, I'm using item, which gets me the current value within an array. Because I'm using range, it will return the number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then all I'm doing for the rest of the values is adding a number to that number and also doing a multiplication of 5. So basically, I'm generating some dummy data in order to demonstrate how this might work. So within the flow, I have that compose that has my header. I then have a select that is generating all that dummy data, which is 100,000 rows. And then we have our 2 branches. We've got the branch on the left, which will generate the graph version of the file, and then the branch on the right, which uses the run scripts. So the first action we have here is actually the same for both branches, and ultimately it's a way of generating an empty file. And this is something that I've done previously using templates and even copying the empty base64 of a file into Power Automate, but there's no native way to create a brand new file. But using the SharePoint REST API and this particular API call that you see here, you can actually create a brand new Excel file, an empty Excel file. So without ever having a template or anything like that, you can use this particular API call, post to your SharePoint site, and then generate an empty Excel file. And obviously the advantage of that is you can generate an empty Excel file anywhere and start populating it with data. So in this case, I have that action here, both on the left and on the right. One file is going to be called the graph API, and the other file is going to be called Office Scripts, and we can have a look at the content of both of them. But then on the left-hand side, if we follow our way down here, looking at the graph API example, you'll see that the logic is quite different. So one of the first things that we need for the graph API is actually the number of columns, and therefore I've got a string running from A through to Z. And so for those that are familiar with using Excel and have seen the letters running across an Excel sheet, ultimately what I'm doing here is I'm going to be dynamically identifying the appropriate letter for a sheet based on the number of columns in the data set. So because my data above here has 3 potential columns, I'm hoping that I'll pick up C dynamically as a result. So in terms of getting the letter number, the next expression I have here is based on a chunk. And so what a chunk is doing is it actually breaks that compose, that string of letters, the A to Z, into individual letters in an array. So chunk with the property 1 will actually break down that string into letters A, B, C, D, all as part of an array. And with that now being an array, it allows me to select values by what's called an integer index. And I'm ultimately using the length of my select, which is up the top here, to determine the appropriate letter for the column. And so this should determine the length being 3, and therefore it will get me the letter C, hopefully. Next up, I have the schema range, or the sheet range. And so the starting column for this is going to be starting cell, sorry, will always be A1. And then using that dynamic column letter, which is now C, hopefully, I then just need to get the range for the number of rows that we're going to be adding in. And again, you'll see the use of that expression length, which enables me to get the length of that select, in this case 100,000, because I'm generating 100,000 sample rows. And I now have a range that's equal to A1 to C 100,000. So with that dynamic value, we're then moving on to that HTTP request that I had showcased in one of the slides. This is the premium action, but it enables me to log on and create a connection as myself. And then I can call the Graph API to a particular location, in this case, my January 24 SharePoint site. And then I am, in this case, able to just get the file ID. So you'll see I've got a request here to just select the ID. So the reason I get the ID, it's needed as one of the parameters for the second invoke an HTTP request. And ultimately, that's what we do here. We have an expression that picks up that ID from the original file that's created, and we also pick up the site ID here off of this invoke an HTTP request. So all this stuff is actually covered in a video, so you should be able to see the expressions on a larger screen, because I tend to share them on a larger screen. And then finally, we have this main invoke an HTTP request, which is patching the data into that sheet. So starting from the very top, we've used compose and select to generate a data set, and then we've created an empty file. We've created the letters A to Z. We've then determined the appropriate letter based on the length of the select in terms of the number of columns. We've then created a sheet range based on the number of rows or number of objects in the select. We have to get some parameters, which include the site ID and the file ID, which we do here. And then in the final action for Graph API, we patch that data in a oneer in this body, passing in the body here from the select, and that will throw that whole array into that sheet in one go. So that covers the left-hand side and how the Graph API works. By comparison, on the right-hand side, you'll see that the run script action is an awful lot simpler. And that's really the power of the Office script, is the fact that you can write a script to do a lot of this for you. You don't have to go and work out how wide your data set is. You don't have to work out how long that data set is. That's all determined by your code in the Office script. So we've already covered this particular action here on the right-hand side. That generates us an empty file. In this case, it's called Excel Office Scripts. Same as before, we need to get the ID of that file because we need to pass that into our run script action. And so this is the power of the script, is that I have this script here called add data to Excel from array, which is hopefully the, if we go back to the tab here, the same name here, add data to Excel from an array. And then you can see the properties, the include header, the format table, the sheet name, the worksheet data. If we jump back into this script here, you can see that again, I have the include header property, the format as table property, the sheet name, and the worksheet data. The worksheet data is expecting an array, and I'm actually combining the header with the body of the select so that I get the column names as well in this solution. So this script has the 4 input parameters. It has the Boolean, the true or false, which is created dynamically based on the Office script. And then I'm passing in the data that's generated from the select, and all being well, it will write data to 2 different Excel files in very quick fashion. So if I just jump over onto this SharePoint site, I'll just do a quick refresh. You can see that we only have the 1 file in here. If we jump into this file that we've had open, and we just jump to the end. So far, during the last 10-15 minutes that I've been speaking, that flow has written 420 rows to a sheet. And what we're going to do now is we're going to put this particular flow into test mode. And remember, it's going to generate 100,000 rows using that select method. And this is where you keep your fingers crossed that everything runs okay and that the demo cods behave. But if we have a look at the select, for instance, while we're waiting, if I click on the output here and it'll open up another tab, we can see the sample data set that's being generated, the incremental number 0, 1, 2, 3, and then some of those expressions, I was adding 1 onto the second property, and then I was multiplying by 5, I think, on the third property, just to generate this random data set. But we can see it's a hefty data set here. There are 100,000 rows. If we jump back onto our flow, your flow has run successfully, which is always a bonus. And we can see both the run script and the invoke an HTTP request has completed. So within about, say, 22, 23 seconds, both of these files have been created. The run script took a bit longer. The invoke an HTTP request, which is a graph API, was obviously quicker. But if we have a look at our SharePoint site, we can see that there are 2 files being created, 2 identical files in terms of file size. If we first have a look at the graph API file, I'll pop that open. You can see that sample data set that was being created by the select. And if I do Control and End, there we go. We can jump to the last row, and I have 100,000 rows. So we've managed to write all 100,000 rows of data into that brand new file that was created by the flow. If I jump into the Office script version of the file, you'll notice a subtle difference with this one, I hope. And that is that not only is all that data in there, if I again the Control and End and jump to the end of my data, we've got 100,001, but the reason we've got 100,001 is because there is a header, and that's one of the features that I've added into this script, so that it accepts a header, it accepts a property to say, does this data include a header? And if it does, and you also set the other property to format as table as true, you'll see that I also have a table in here. So if you did want to then use the native functionality of Power Automate to access that data as part of a table within Excel, that data that I've just passed into the Excel file is already neatly formatted as a table and ready for those native Excel actions. And of course, you could send that straight away in an email off to someone with all that data, and it's taken just 20 seconds to produce. If I just jump back to the history, we can see that the flow actually took 25 seconds. Thankfully, one second quicker than it did when I tested it out just 6 days ago. So hopefully that one made sense. The last flow that I want to show you is very similar. If I go into Edit and we have a look at the content of this flow, you'll see that the structure of the flow is identical in terms of the 2 branches. I've got the left-hand branch here, which is going to run the graph API, and I've got the right-hand side, which is going to run the script. But off the back of that, I'm actually going to get the file content, I think, just of one of the files, albeit I could potentially get the file content of both. And then it's going to send me an email, and that email will contain the export, and the data is going to come from a data set. So I'm just going to open up another tab, and I will get my mail client loaded. And we will give this flow a run. So just very quickly, just to explain that the top bit, there is a slight difference. I'm now going to use that same Power BI data source that I have from that first flow that I ran using the sort of traditional method, which writes a row, one row at a time. This is obviously going to write the data as a batch. It's going to write all 20,000 rows in one API call using that run script or using that patch to graph. I am using the parse JSON just in order to access the expressions from the data set that's been generated from this query. And just like before, I have a header column. In this case, it's column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I've called them, but of course you could have your own namings. But again, just to call out, this is a nested array. You'll see I have the opening and closing square brackets, but also opening and closing square brackets around the header. And then I'm using a select, and that select is taking the values from our query data set in Power BI, and it is turning that into a nested array. So again, traditionally you would see using an object, but here I'm using a nested array, and that's what allows us just to plant that data in that nested array structure straight into our brand new empty Excel files that we create. Beyond that, it's all the same. I'm just going to see if we have, I should have thought about having unique file names. Have I done that? Yes, Power BI, that's got a Power BI in it, and that one there has also got Power BI in it. Of course, if I wanted it to be completely dynamic, I could use something like a type date timestamp with UTC now or something like that. So the rest of the flow should hopefully all make sense. It's exactly the same as before. I'm simply going to put this flow into test mode. I'll hit the save, I'll hit the test, and what it should do is it should grab all 20,000 rows from the Power BI data set using the DAX query at the top here, which might take a wee while just to get 20,000 rows. It was taking 4 seconds, it's not too bad. But then if you think about it, we are going to be writing all that data into 2 files that we've created, one via the run script, one via the invoke an HTTP request, finished very quickly, 8 seconds and 6 seconds. And then it should send me an email. And if I bring across my browser there, you should be able to see 1641, which is right now we have a file with 932 bytes of data in it, and we have data from that same Power BI source. And if I jump to the very bottom, I have 20,001 rows because there is a header with column 1 to 6 at the top. And so what we've demonstrated there is writing data from a Power BI data set, 20,000 rows, using 2 different methods. One, using the Graph API on the left-hand side, using this invoke an HTTP request, and then obviously one on the right-hand side, using that run script, which is a TypeScript. Again, writing all that data rather efficiently into those 2 files, and then, well, save them where you require them, but equally forward them on if there's a requirement for that. But a rather efficient method for writing data to Excel using one of those 2 methods. And just to see where's that original file? Is it book 9? No. I was going to open there it is, the original file that I kicked off at the beginning. If I do Control and End, in the time that I've done all those demos, that traditional flow, it grabbed all 20,000 of those rows from Excel, and it's currently up at 825 rows using that looping. You can do things like turn on concurrency, which obviously would improve the efficiency of the flow, but it's worth noting that one of the key reasons I like to demonstrate these things and demonstrate the efficiency techniques of Power Automate is that there are API limits, and these API limits we've managed to get away with for some time, but there will be enforcement. And if you continue to build inefficient flows and write large amounts of data using apply to each loops, etc., you'll start to find that your flows will become throttled, You may already experience throttling. There are also limitations with the Excel action, for instance, where files can become locked, and you'll see blog posts where people put in delays. These are really not repeatable methods for writing data, and that's very much why I try and showcase these things and spread some awareness. So I realize we've got about 15 minutes left. That's really me come to the end of my session, and I very much like to encourage folk who haven't already to connect with me online. You'll find me anywhere really as Damien Bird 365, either on my YouTube, my LinkedIn, my blog site, Twitter, etc. But back over and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Damien, for a great presentation and demos. So now we will get into the questions and answers part.
Cool.
Should you wish to ask a question, feel free to type it into the question window now. Our first question today is, any possibilities of having loops within the script?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So actually, one of the first scripts I did, I've got about 10 videos I think now on Office scripts on my YouTube, and obviously, like anyone, you learn as you go. So yeah, I don't think. Well, I say you're never an expert in these things. You're always learning. You're always stretching yourself to learn more. And one of the first examples of using Office scripts, because I'm not a pro coder, I'm a low coder by default. I built a script that used a for loop, and it was rather inefficient. So yes, it can be done, but even within pro code, there are efficiencies. And I discovered that if you're writing data in bulk via an Office script, you are actually better to create that nested array and just throw it into the sheet rather than write it row by row, because you can go through a for each loop. But there will be scenarios where you want that for each loop. So absolutely, you can create loops. If you are doing filters on categories or something like that, you might pass the categories into the script and then loop through those categories using a for each loop, and then do your filtering and capturing data. It's another powerful language you've got within Office scripts to automate with and combine it with Power Automate. So it's quite exciting, to be honest.
Perfect. So this is the next question. Could it be possible to create an Excel file populated by attenders registered in a booking session, for example?
Yeah, again, I mean, it really depends on, I guess, where you capture that data and how you anticipate that process working. I mean, traditionally, if you thought about using something like a Microsoft form, that's public facing. You can ask people to complete that. And then the traditional way of capturing that data is every time someone submits a response, you write the Excel file. And obviously that's not going to bring much efficiency because you're just writing each person as they complete the form. But equally, say you had a rather successful event with hundreds of people, and maybe you don't want to write all that data initially, then if there was an API, and in fact there is an unpublished API from Microsoft Forms, you could retrieve all that data using an API call, and then rather than using the traditional method of inserting a table into a sheet and then writing each row into the sheet using that applying to each method that we've seen is rather inefficient, you could look at either the graph method or the Office script method and just throw all that data straight into the sheet, and bang, you've got it. There's no delay, and you're not over-committing on the APIs. I think that's something really to think about, is when you build these flows, don't create unnecessary loops in your flows if you can.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions. So on behalf of the ESPC community, we would like to extend a big thank you to you, Damien, for taking the time today to carry out this webinar. We really appreciate it. So that's the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Thanks again to all of you for joining us today, and I hope you'll join us again soon. Take care.
Cheers, folks. Thank you.